Hello. Hi. Thank you for your flexibility recently. And we're covering the Southern colonies today. And so let me get your names down. Angelina, would you be willing to type your last name for me or unmute yourself and tell me?
My last name is Ruiz.
R-U-I-Z Ruiz. Thank you. Great, great, great. All right, great to have you. Perhaps you've had a chance to look at the handout, perhaps not. And so I just want to give a brief introduction to the Southern colonies, okay? Let's see here. All right, so we're doing the Southern colonies, and the Mason-Dixon line has determined that the Southern colonies are Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. All right, is what we're dealing with. And in historiography, what they often try to do is they try to find a narrative that leads to the Civil War. So oftentimes what you're going to find in colonial histories is you're going to find kind of a dichotomy of differences, right? A contrast between the northern colonies and the southern colonies, implying that they were a bit incompatible and bound to go into two separate directions. A couple of things that I don't have on the PowerPoint that are of note regarding that thesis, okay, is one, of course, is that the soil, the alluvial soil in the South and the weather were more amenable to cash crop farming. So hence the common narrative states that that to the north, for instance, in the New England colonies, because of course you have your exceptions, Western New York and most of Pennsylvania in the north are very good for farming, no doubt. Delaware as well. But what they contend is like with the New England colonies is that they had poor soil. They had poor soil there, and so they almost it was a blessing in disguise. They could not rely solely upon agriculture and become like a mercantilist colony to England and providing raw materials and produce to England and allow England to in turn furnish them with all their finished products. In the North, they're going to diversify. They're going to have a lot more industries. They're going to eventually take on the Industrial Revolution and somewhat leave the South behind. But in the South, by contrast, they had good soil, good weather for cash crop farming, especially for cotton, for rice, indigo, tobacco, the big money makers. Another part of that narrative is the type of class or demographic that colonized effectively each section. When you look at the North, especially New England, the New England states that we do next, a lot of them came from the cities, Bristol, Liverpool, London, and a lot of them were part of the burgeoning, the growing middle class. All right. And so the idea is like to this day, when you go to San Francisco, et cetera, there's kind of a self-image that the bourgeoisie, the people of the city, embrace. And that is that this kind of heady sense that they are progressive, they are more progressive, more forward-looking, more modernized than their rural counterparts, those who stay out in the country, etc. And so the argument is that when you look at a gentleman named David Hackett Fisher with a C in the Fisher name, he has some books on this, and he contends that you find a demographic difference. A lot of bourgeois people from the city moved into the northern colonies, and in the South, you have a very strong contrast between the gentry class, Gentry, and the gentry class were nobility. They were accustomed to agriculture back in England. They were rural, outside of the urban areas of the cities, although they oftentimes had property in the cities as well because of their wealth and their political connections. And they had their own culture, their own, it's called the Cavalier culture, right? Cavalier. And so he said they're depicted as being more old-fashioned, more traditional, less democratic, more for people showing deference to their social betters, knowing your place and accepting the superiority of others. And then, of course, they brought in the lion's share, the South, that is, of indentured servants and slaves. And we're going to get into that today as well. All right. And so that's what oftentimes historians are ambitiously, apt to do, is try to tie a narrative from the very beginning up to the coming Civil War, and showing how the South was so distinctly different and a bit, quote, backward, and not just backward, but inequitable, right? And remember, by inequitable, I mean mainly economically, but also politically and socially, kind of imbalanced, undemocratic, not egalitarian, but that you have a strong hierarchy. And you saw that at the end of your Black Legend assignment. Remember when colonial Virginia was depicted as an oligarchy ruled by the few. You had just a handful of families that monopolized the council positions over the colony. A lot of the same family names were elected into the assembly. And so they formed kind of an aristocracy, if you will. Remember, and aristoi means the best in Greek. So ruled by this kind of elite. And the person who symbolizes that is a guy named Berkeley. It's spelled like Berkeley, but for whatever reasons, it was pronunciated Barclay. He was the governor, Lord Berkeley, William. And he made no bones about it. He tried to bring in the cream of the crop of the English gentry class into Virginia, offering them land, offering them positions in the royal council, monopolies in trade, etc. All right. But first, chronologically, you get into the English, right? And a lot of the narratives, the English as the ugly imperialist. Remember, imperialist is that you're a national bully. You impose your will on other sovereign people without their permission. And so King James I, right? He issued 2 charters, and he granted all lands, woods, soil, grounds, havens, ports, rivers, mines, minerals to his joint stock companies. The London Company, also known as the Virginia Company, and then the company that would become synonymous with New England. And so, as if all the land that the Native Americans were on were his to claim, right? That type of hubris, that type of ethnocentrism. He's claiming Native American land that's not his own for Mother England. The Powhatan, that was the major tribe in Virginia. You're probably familiar with the famous story of Captain John Smith being captured by Powhatan's younger brother, Opechancanough, and brought before them, and that they were seemingly about to kill him. And young Pocahontas came to his rescue. That's where you get the story. And of course, that story comes from him. You also have a couple other individuals who wrote of events, but the other 2 are also Englishmen. So unfortunately, we don't have a written account on behalf of the Native American, the Powhatan people. And so, which is completely unfair in trying to discern what happened, especially if you're playing the blame game, right? And doing conflict history of winners and losers and trying to decide who to vilify. And so that's important to remember. So at any rate, you have the London South Virginia Company, right? And look what it says here. Build a fort with an invulnerable facade before that they perceive you mean to plant among them. The natives will certainly grow discontented with your habitation. So avoid selling or giving arms to them, and try not to offend them, but take care of your own firstly. Those were actual directives from the Joint Stock Company to the adventurers, as they were called, those who were the pioneers who were willing to come and settle. And so at any rate, it was a money-making venture. They didn't try to hide that. They were here for profit. They were trying to engage in finding minerals. Of course, they were hoping they would get lucky like the Spanish did in Bolivia and Peru and Mexico and find silver or gold, which of course didn't happen. So in that event of failure, they were to find some type of crop or commodity that could be of great use. So in the future, the South is going to be known for cotton, tobacco, especially rice and indigo to color clothing, etc. And also tar and pitch from the sap of the trees to form an adhesive for shipbuilding. So those were the main things. So notice, right? They knew they were not going to be welcomed by the natives, and they didn't care. They said to make a palisade, a fortified fort that is invulnerable, that is not vulnerable, right? That is imposing in reality and in perception to kind of scare and deter the Native Americans from attacking. When they came in, they went into the Paspahegh territory, and right away they began building a cross, and they built a fort without permission of Powhatan, the leader of a 12-tribe confederation of Native Americans there in Virginia. They tried to form treaties with separate sub-tribes underneath Powhatan without his permission, until he finally insisted that they come and visit him. And so hence, right, you have that image of the English being the ugly imperialist, trying to impose their will, coming uninvited, and they don't care. All right. And so then, so you have their deliberately insubordinate diplomacy. They formed sub treaties with the Arohatec, the Pamunkey, and other tribes. Symbolic assertiveness. They planted a cross in Parahunts. He was a Werewants, a sub-chief, and without his permission, they planted a cross. They created a palisaded fort in Paspahegh territory without the Paspahegh Werewants' permission. And then eventually, they literally pushed Powhatan to a knee and to get him to bow to King James I of England. So a lot of this serves as incriminating evidence written down by the English themselves, sharing this type of information. Okay. I'm trying to look at my notes here, like if you're interested in knowing any other primary sources besides John Smith. Here are a few others. This is just FYI. You don't need to know this for a test or anything. A man named George Percy wrote about this history. A man named Gabriel Archer, A-R-C-H-E-R. Of course, Edward Wingfield, who was a leader. Wing like the wings of a bird, and then field like a field to plant. And then an interesting stories from a man named William Strachey, S-T-R-A-C-H-E-Y. So at any rate, you have some other primary sources, and we try to put everything together from what these Englishmen wrote, and you have to consider the source. So, and then Captain John Smith, you're going to read about it, but he engaged in somewhat Machiavellian tactics, right? And by that, I mean, you'd rather be feared than loved, do what pragmatically brings about the best results, not necessarily what is the most upright thing to do morally. So he lied to Powhatan on several occasions, contending that it was for the better of the English and their survival. Because you have to remember also, they were vulnerable. They came initially about 144 of them, and half of them died the first winter. By 1610, they were still down just into the small hundreds population-wise. And the Powhatan Confederacy had thousands. Supposedly, at the snap of his finger, Powhatan had control of at least 7,000 warriors. So they were in a vulnerable position with the mighty Powhatan Confederation. On March 22nd, 1622, Opie Chancano, the brother of Powhatan, for several reasons and grievances, one being the murder of a Native American Werewants, and the English would not take responsibility for that murder, began a concerted attack throughout most of the Jamestown colony. and it almost completely annihilated Jamestown. And so when that was done, the royal crown abrogated or did away. It was technically the Privy Council underneath the crown, did away with their charter and made it a royal colony instead of a joint stock company private colony. So it became a royal colony. 9 of the 13 colonies will become royally controlled. All right. And then indentured servitude, that was supposed to be volitional. You were supposed to choose to serve between 3 and 7 years as an agricultural laborer on someone else's land. They paid for your trip across the Atlantic. They paid for your supplies and resources and fed you and clothed you. And in return, you gave them service until the end of that contract. But at the end of the contract, you were supposed to receive freedom dues. And the freedom dues amounted to a skill that you were supposed to have acquired and have learned under as an apprentice so that you could practice and ostensibly become self-sufficient. A head right of land, and a head right was an official amount of land that was considered sufficient for you to prove yourself in paying your taxes on that land as an interested, responsible subject to the crown, and hence entitled to what we would call, they didn't call it that, they called it subjectship, citizenship rights. And you were supposed to be granted that at the end of your indenture. But when you look at Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N, and his book on American history, he contends that at least 3/4 of the indentured servants never received their freedom dues, or if they did, they couldn't keep their land. And so that indentured servitude did not serve very well in Virginia as a stepping stone to what we would call later the American dream of socioeconomic ascension, rising up. They were afforded the rights of Englishmen, and they fought for the rights to have an assembly. Okay. And an assembly was the representative elective body that helped pass the laws of the colony. So notice in a lot of the colonies on paper, they were somewhat Republican, and I don't mean the party Republican. I mean like a republic defined by Aristotle as a mixture of monarchical government with a strong chief executive in the form of a governor, to a certain extent an aristocracy, an elite group that was handpicked, and that was the Royal Council. And then a degree of democracy. Demos means the people in Greek, where the people, right, usually in villages of hundreds from English tradition, could elect one representative to help pass the laws in the form of the assembly. So the assembly was supposed to be the voice, the spokesman for the colonists. And in 1619, you have the first famous mention of slaves coming into Virginia. Ironically, the same year that the assembly was established. So representative government and slavery, ironically, were introduced into colonial Virginia the same year. Maryland was unique in that it was a proprietorship. It was owned technically by the Calvert family, George and Cecilius Calvert, known as the Lords of Baltimore. So hence where we get the term Baltimore for their city. And it was meant to be a haven for Roman Catholics in England to come and immigrate to, who were being persecuted, especially after a guy named Guy Fawkes, a Roman Catholic, tried to assassinate the king. And but it didn't last long until there was a guy named Claiborne and others who became a thorn in the side of Cecilius Calvert and threatened anarchy if they didn't bring about freedom of conscience and allow equality, political equality between Protestant and Catholic settlers there in Maryland. And also they insisted upon having an assembly, an elected body. So notice this all plays into the war for independence in the future, right? Where the English, whether it was a proprietor owning a colony or a royal takeover by the crown in the form of a royal colony or a joint stock company, colony after colony, they insisted on having an assembly. But oftentimes, from what I've read, it was not the intention of the English authorities to have an assembly, but we fought for kind of the squeaky wheel got the grease, if you will, and we fought for and got them. Because remember, in the war for independence, we're going to insist that the assemblies give their permission for all laws and all taxes to be passed, right? No taxation without representation. So this will play into the war for independence heavily. Indentured servitude in Maryland developed a much better reputation than it did in Virginia. You had spokesmen there who rose from rags to riches as ex-indentured servants. And I liken it today to working a menial job, a job that doesn't pay much, doesn't have much in promotional opportunities, but you're doing the job for now while you're going to school. Because obviously you don't intend to stay there, right? And you intend to move up from that position. And so that was the sense of expectancy, if you will, from the indentured servants. The Carolinas were begun as a proprietorship also by 8 Barbadian nobility members. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina was pretty conservative, pretty aristocratic, not much power to an assembly. You had to own a freehold to even be able to vote. You had to own more than that amount of land to run for office when they did have an assembly. They also instituted some of the harshest slave codes in the 1640s. They began in Virginia. I think it was a little bit after that in Carolinas, but they were more severe. And they likened the slave codes to those in Barbados and Jamaica. And they had a fierce reputation for their treatment of slaves in Barbados and Jamaica. In fact, you have a primary source quote from a governor contending that a slave didn't last longer than 10 years before dying in the Caribbean. Such were the harsh conditions and the harsh treatment of them. You also have evidence, as you see in this handout, of a quote glut in the market, more slaves than there was demand for those slaves. And so sadly, as in a regular commodity, when the supply greatly exceeds the demand, the price drops. And the price dropped right at the wrong time, right at the time, about the time of the 1660s, just before Bacon's Rebellion. And we're going to get into that very soon. Then Georgia, just James Oglethorpe, he tried a utopian society in Georgia. He tried to give free land out to debtors, those who were in prison for debt. He banned alcohol, he banned slavery. But in a nutshell, he went broke. And he ended up selling his proprietorship of Georgia. It became a royal colony, and it almost immediately accepted and institutionalized slaves and slavery. Very quickly, right, as soon as the Europeans got involved in sub-Saharan, beneath the Sahara Desert, African slavery, you find rationalization. So you have Leo Africanus, you have Gomez, Zurara, and others who wrote basically this, what will become later the Sambo image, S-A-M-B-O. And the Sambo image was of the happy-go-lucky, ignorant, animal-like African person, man especially, who is a creature of instinct, follows his impulses without any self-control, has the mind of an ignorant child, and could not handle freedom if it were given to him. So pretty convenient, right? For justifying slavery. You also had a Persian writer and another Portuguese writer from their travels, and these were extensively spread. An historian really good on this subject is Ibram, I-B-R-A-M, Kendi, K-E-N-D-I, if you wanted to look further into that subject of stigmatizing Africans. So Aristotle had spoken about natural slaves. Some people are born to be slaves. And again, that Sambo type image. They couldn't handle freedom if it were given to them. They were too ignorant, but yet they were physically strong. And that nature had intended them to become the slaves of more self-controlled, rationally oriented, intelligent beings. And then you have a couple other names, Ibn Khaldun and Tabari, if you wanted to look further into that. So by 1415, the Portuguese were in Morocco. By the 1480s, they had established Elmina, which had become a very infamous slave depot for trade. They infiltrated the Congo, even taking over the Congo and making a puppet of their ruler and making him become Christian, Roman Catholic. By the 1580s, hundreds of thousands were coming from Angola to Brazil, to Portuguese Brazil. And then you see here, by the 1530s, the French were in Senegal and the Gambia River. By the 1640s, the Dutch had built Fort Nassau and were at Luanda and Luango Coast. And by the 1550s, the English were in Guinea. In 1572, they were granted Portuguese permission to trade to North America from the Guinea coast. So a guy named John Hawkins quickly got a monopoly to trade slaves for England to the Americas. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. I'll post this happily, but I want to stop sharing this and go to the argumentative handout. So number one, capitalism for better and for worse. The argument is this is an argument of relativity. It's comparing the North American continent to England proper and saying that changes were brought about so that more opportunities than existed back in England began to open up here in America. So for one, right, is America, as historian Paul Johnson states, was land abundant and labor scarce. Plenty of land to take as opposed to England, right, which is a relatively small island shared with Scotland. Much more land here in North America for the taking. And then the fact that it was labor scarce implies that there was a sense of precariousness, a sense of almost desperation by the English authorities to try to induce laborers to come. So hence they offered higher wages here in the US than were offered back in England for comparable work. So the joint stock companies, for instance, right? They open up and they, you could be a contributor to the joint stock company, and whatever percentage of the funds of the capital that you put in, you would get that same percentage of the company's profits and whatever commodities they were trading. So you could make a lot of money not leaving England, but just investing in the company. And so hence, if you were wealthy, that happened. Nevertheless, if you had no capital, but if you were willing to risk your life and limb by coming over here, they would treat you as if you had contributed funds to the joint stock company, when in reality you hadn't. So you had a way of bringing about dividends without even putting a pence into the pot. If you were willing to come and risk life and limb, settle and engage in some type of cash crop farming, find some type of commodity that was of worth and could be sold at the markets on behalf of the merchant, the joint stock company. You also could come, as I mentioned, as an indentured servant. And especially during the 1640s and 50s in Maryland, a pretty decent percentage of the indentured servants did well for themselves at the end of their terms. And again, salaries were higher here than back in England proper. So hence England is getting away from its mercantilist system. It's evolving toward a more open market, a more capitalistic economy. And that is helping out the less fortunate back in England who want to come here. States this argument. Nevertheless, as it says, capitalism for better and for worse, those who already had money had a huge leg up over those who didn't. And for instance, the head right system. In Maryland, it became ridiculous how much. For every 5 servants, you can get like 5,000 acres of free land at one point under the Baltimore family. But oftentimes it was 50 acres for every servant that you could afford to hire and bring here. You were granted 50 acres for that one servant. So imagine bringing over 100 servants. That amounts to a lot of free land if you're wealthy. And so hence they're developed, a somewhat inequitable land distribution where most of those, especially like on the Tidewater coast of Virginia, received the best and most of the best land. And a common theme was when the best seats in the House had already been taken along the coast where governments and cities were formed, then the best thing for you to do in your mind in these generations was to head west and head into the frontier. But then you have problems with that. Is for one, you're not automatically represented in the colonial assembly when you move into the frontier. Secondly, you're treading upon Native American land. And they're not going to likely take too kindly to that. And so you're going to have to fight with them over that. So you have the common conflicts of those who moved into the Western frontier regions of claiming that they were underrepresented by their governments and crying out for help against Native American attacks. Then numbers 2 and 3 play the blame game. Number 2 is the more politically correct, contemporarily popular interpretation that the English were the villains. They were greedy, they were ungrateful, they were manipulative and duplicitous. And Powhatan in particular, the leader of the Confederation in Virginia, was long-suffering, humble, meek with the power that he had, allowed them to survive 2 starving periods. Their first winter and their 3rd or 4th winter were extremely harsh, where easily about half of them died. So it highlights, right, the Native American perspective. And this book is by Helen Roundtree. Number 3, a very bold thesis by David Price. He defends the English. kind of like Castillo did with the Spanish. He contends that the Native Americans were anything but meek sheep, right? He shows Powhatan as an imperialist amongst the Native Americans, duplicitous himself, and given the okay to ambush attempts on more than one occasion, insistent upon gaining the white man's weaponry, and in his book, right, the leaders who at first were the main contributors to the company were inept. They got their positions because of their wealth, not by merit. They were naive, as depicted in this book, and just lacking pragmatism, lacking good common sense. And some of them were killed. And time again, John Smith, a commoner, warns people of impending attacks that tend to materialize and thus kind of corroborate the validity of what he was warning. And so slowly, as the people become more and more vulnerable of Jamestown and more distrustful of the Native American Confederation around them, they began to look to John Smith as their natural leader. So David Price goes so far as to justify what John Smith does, because John Smith engaged in extortion, forced Native American tribes to sell corn to them or threaten violence upon them. And he excuses that and even makes a hero out of John Smith and contends that he was just the practical, quasi-ruthless leader that they needed for that time against such a formidable foe as the Powhatan Confederation. Number 4 states that slavery was an economic and not a racist decision. This is very argumentative, okay? When I put this one together, I had a smile on my face. It's not necessarily what I personally believe, but I thought it was thought-provoking and hence put it in there. You clearly have evidence, you guys, of racism from the very beginning. You had an Englishman who was whipped for sleeping with a black woman. They said that he profaned himself, his family name, and his own body by sleeping with an African. You had clear fear of miscegenation between white women and black men. So that at first they stated that because some of the white men were sleeping with the black women and they wanted to keep their biracial kids enslaved. So at first it went by ventrum, by stomach, by womb, the Latin term stated. And so whatever the mom was, that was the status of the kid. But when instances were publicized of white women sleeping with black men, they wanted to punish the white women even more so. And they did a 180 and switched and said that the status of the baby follows the father instead of the mother. So that anytime an African man gave birth to a child, those children would be deemed as slaves. And what you find is in this argument is that slaves developed a reputation that was amenable to enslaving them, that they were physically hardy and didn't die from malaria. And some people even, entertain this notion very seriously to this day. And they look into the famous sickle cell trait of people of African descent and contend that from the Ivory Coast and other areas of Africa, that they had developed an immunity to malaria, and that there's a scientific explanation for them being hardy and not dying, especially cultivating sugar when you're in the humidity and you're waist deep in water with mosquitoes. that the Africans did much better than Native Americans and in white indentured servants as far as their hardiness. You also had a declining, by the 1670s, a declining availability of white indentured servants. You had a great fire in London, and the poor were encouraged to stay in England and help rebuild London and to be paid for it. And other variables like that brought down the number of indentured servants when they were greatly needed. And you also had, from Bacon's Rebellion, the notion that white laborers were too dangerous because they had hope, because they had expectations. You had also a glut in the slave market, more slaves than there was demand for them, so hence the price of them went down. And according to one source that I've read recently, that at one point it was only 5 more shillings, not much more at all, to buy a slave and get that slave for life and get that slave's children for life than to get an indentured servant for the very most of 7 years. So hence it became more economically sound. It made more economic sense to just pay a tiny bit more and get much more for it in the form of a slave. And according to this argument, racism followed slavery to justify it. And of course, you could find the antithesis in other books that contend that no, racism played a part in the origin of slavery, not following it as a convenient justification for it. So just another reason why I find history to be fascinating. I love the disagreement. There you see a map of the modern transatlantic slave trade. Most of them went to South America and the Caribbean. And a much smaller percentage went to North America. And of course, primarily into the South, into the Southern English colonies. Number 5, African American agency. When the Carolinas were owned by a joint stock company, or by private proprietors, that is, there was such desperation for labor that African slaves made demands and they received concessions, primarily, right, manumission, official freedom. There was a great desire to hunt and need for such. There was a great desire to make tar and pitch from the sap of the trees, and not enough laborers, and demands by the leaders to have so much quantity-wise offered in an allotted amount of time. There were attacks by the Yamasee and the other tribes, and a kind of a slave trade amongst prisoners of war. So they needed protection against the Native Americans, who were oftentimes allied with the French in the Carolinas. And the Black Africans were no dummies. They said, oh, you need my help to do such and such? Then what's in it for me? And they were granted a variety of things, but ultimately, many of them, manumission, freedom. Remember, this is called agency in historiography, where you contend that certain demographics that are oftentimes depicted as helpless victims with which we are to empathize in conflict history accounts, that they were not to be just condescendingly seen as victims alone, that they made decisions that mattered, that helped alter the course of history. So this is an example of the human agency of Africans in the Carolinas. And the title says everything here. Of course, slave conditions were awful, right? Sorry, I'm getting another name down. So, of course, slave conditions were awful. A gentleman named Fogel and Ingerman actually had the audacity to write a book to contend that slaves were not treated that badly because they were expensive investments. So it was in the best economic interest of their masters, their planters, to treat them well, so that they could maximize their productivity. Too much evidence leans to the contrary to that. You have human excavation of bones, deterioration of the hip and shoulder bones, and they know the difference between something like osteoporosis or arthritis and just downright heavy external labor and grinding the hip bones and the shoulder bones. Scientists can discern the difference, and they have evidence of the latter. You also have accounts by the madams or mistresses of the homes, writing in diaries and letters of correspondence that give testimony to how brutally the slaves were treated. And not to make a simplistic dichotomy, but oftentimes, right, the domestic slaves were tormented sexually and psychologically and emotionally. And the plantation slaves outside were oftentimes tormented physically. You also have evidence of the planters playing this divide and conquer tactic, whereby they would hire middlemen, their foremen, oftentimes poor whites, sometimes even well-behaved black slaves. And they would give them ultimatums on how much work had to be done in an allotted amount of time. And it would be their job that would be lost if the slaves didn't meet that expectation. So almost setting the foreman up to become the hated middleman, whipping and beating and threatening the slaves, where the planter could kind of stay back and almost act ignorant of their treatment and be shielded from criticism. But also, right, the laws, the slave codes were so draconian. If you raised your hand in defiance and in physical intimidation with ill intent toward your white master or foreman, you would be heavily punished. And after the second or third time, you could even be executed. If you were whipped and died in the process, the master had to pay a small fee and register it with the governor and the assembly of the colony with a slap on the wrist, because it was your property that you destroyed. So nothing even remotely tantamount to murder or even manslaughter could be held against you. But even so, right, even with such draconian laws, there's evidence of rebellion, of defiance. And numerically, the number one instance seems to be that of absconding, a fancy word for running away. So my argument here is, if they face such harsh penalties, why would in so many instances slaves act so defiantly if their conditions were not miserable? Kind of an indirect argument.
Can I have a question?
Sure.
So this Robert Fogel and Stanley Angerman, they didn't know this, or why did they say that there was no, but that the slaves were okay, kind of?
Yeah, you know what, they they made some concessions. They knew that there was historical evidence of slaves being whipped, of slaves being killed. But what they tried to make the argument was that was not the norm. That most slaves, and it's almost comical. It's been a long time since I've read their book, but they would contend that the average field slave was only whipped 1 to 2 times in his life, as if 1 to 2 times is okay, you know. And so they qualified what they said. They couldn't get around certain evidence, right, of brutality, which they couldn't deny if they wanted to. But they tried to make the claim that brutality was not the norm for economic reasons, right? That if you have an expensive horse, why would you beat that horse? But instead, why wouldn't you feed it well? Why wouldn't you address its wounds and injuries so that it could be back in tip-top shape working for you as soon as possible? So I don't know if I answered your question very well. I'm sorry if I didn't.
No, this I didn't like this one that much because it is I just don't see why would these two people say that they were healthy and relatively pleasant when they weren't, when there were so many other evidence that they weren't.
Right.
Like this word that pleasant is just really weird.
Yeah. And you know what? I think it was because it was so outrageous. That's why that book became famous. And so some people even imply that they did it for attention in academia, because they knew that it would raise the eyebrows of the entire academic community, and it did. It got a lot of people to read their book.
Oh, suppose.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, it's what it is, that they had the audacity to print that. So clearly this number is a rebuttal to them, right?
Yeah.
And then Native American agency with the French, you're going to find evidence of Native Americans bullying the French, right, along the Mississippi River, dictating terms to them, allying with them. And then when the French became vulnerable in time of war, they would heighten their expectations and their demands, knowing that the French desperately needed it. So on the one hand, when I read this book, I almost felt like it impugned the Native Americans. It made them look like bullies, right? But supposedly the main intention of the book is again to demonstrate the agency of Native Americans, that they made decisions that mattered. They at one time were in the driver's seat, if you will, to control situations. And then another obvious underlying theme to that book, I think, is demonstrating to us why we're not speaking French right now, is that the French were not able to bring enough resources with them to impose their will on the Native Americans. But in this case, right, they were actually bullied by the Native Americans instead. So I thought it was thought-provoking and something that was worth putting in the assignment. And please note the title of the last one, French Louisiana Fluid by Accident, right? So implying that more opportunities, more autonomy to do as they pleased, erupted, if you will, evolved in French Louisiana than was ever deliberately intended by the French colonial leaders. And again, like number 7, largely because they didn't bring enough resources. They didn't have enough men. They didn't have enough women. They didn't have enough soldiers. They didn't have enough supplies. And so hence, they grudgingly conceded the right for their inhabitants to marry whom they wanted, namely, right, African and Native American, people to trade what they wanted because there was a scarcity of supplies. And one famous case, for instance, right? Lacombe de Iberville, the governor, he wrote a letter back to France and stated, "We are not getting what we need." And he says, "This is my final plea before I start to openly trade with pirates." Because of course, the infamous pirates of the Caribbean were, they didn't just get involved in illicit piracy. They also had, bona fide trade to make their money. And so you had people like Jean Lafitte, Laffite, Jean. Jean Lafitte was an infamous pirate. And he ended up becoming a respectable guy in New Orleans, had a nice home. Some even jokingly stated that he was an inch away from running for political office. Had a lot of fans there, and he provided a lot of trade in black market goods at the port of New Orleans. So hence people married whom they wanted, procreated with whom they wanted, engaged in economic transactions that they did not have legal monopolistic papers to justify, but they did so anyway. Again, because the French were short on resources and desperate. So French Louisiana became relatively fluid with a lot of freedoms and opportunities for a lot of people, but it was not intended by their leaders. It just evolved that way. Because remember, they hadn't had the French Revolution yet. So this is the Ancien regime, right? This is the way of things before the French Revolution, where you had, a crown like Louis XIV who said, "I am the law," with a very, very weak parliament. You had a system of nobility and patronage, whereby only if you had the right family name and connections were you given the right trading opportunities and papers and monopolies. But the idea is that they tried to transplant that way of life here to Louisiana from France, and it didn't translate. Largely, again, because of their lack of resources. They didn't have enough soldiers to enforce the laws. They didn't have enough French women to marry the French men and form nuclear families. And they didn't have enough products and goods that were in demand at New Orleans. Okay, so are there any questions? All right. Well, thank you. That concludes my lecture on it. I hope this helped and gave you some context to the assignment. Please remember to read all the sections, okay? You're analyzing and evaluating just one, but you have test questions on virtually everyone. So make sure that you're familiar with the general thesis of all of them. Okay? And I wish you well, and I'll try to catch up and do your grade your second assignment soon. And but you guys did pretty darn well on that first assignment. You're already, pretty much reaching where my subjective expectations are. So good job. And happy to give you extra credit again on this assignment for being here today. All right, so thank you and have a good week. I'll see you next Tuesday, okay?
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.